The year is 322 before the Common Era, and in a rented house on the island of Euboea, an old man lies fevered, his stomach failing, his breath shallow and laboured. Aristotle, the student of Plato, the teacher of Alexander, the cataloguer of nearly all human knowledge, should have died that autumn. The physicians had given up. His students had begun preparing for the funeral rites. The philosophical schools of Athens were already debating who would inherit his legacy and his library. But he did not die. His eyes opened once more as the fever broke, and the sunlight streaming through the window seemed different somehow, softer, eternal, as if time itself had shifted its relationship to his body. He rose from that bed, feeling the weight of his 62 years pressing into bones and joints, yet sensing something else, something impossible, a vitality that should not have returned, a continuation that defied the natural order he had spent his life studying. Time would move forward, empires would crumble, languages would be born and forgotten, entire civilizations would rise from dust and return to dust, and he would remain. This is not the story of what Aristotle accomplished in his mortal years, not a recounting of the Lyceum or the Nicomachean Ethics or his tutelage of the boy who would become Alexander the Great, but rather what unfolded across the centuries when those years never ended, when the mind that organized the stars and named the virtues and classified the animals continued watching, learning, questioning, as the world transformed around him in ways he could never have imagined, in directions his systematic philosophy had never anticipated. The Lyceum in Athens, where he once walked among columns and taught beneath the shade of trees, debating with students about virtue and logic and the nature of the soul, that would fade into memory, become ruins, be forgotten and excavated and turned into a tourist site. But the walking, the teaching, the endless observation of nature and humanity, that would never cease, that would continue through empires and dark ages and revolutions, an unbroken thread of consciousness witnessing the great unfolding of human becoming. In the decades following that impossible survival, Aristotle moved quietly through the Hellenistic world, a scholar without a home, watching as his former student's empire fractured into warring kingdoms ruled by Alexander's generals. He had taught the boy about virtue and moderation, about the golden mean between extremes, about ruling justly, and then watched him conquer the known world with a ferocity that seemed to mock every lesson about temperance. Now Alexander was dead, his empire divided, and Aristotle walked among the successor states feeling like a ghost at his own funeral, hearing his name invoked, his works cited, his ideas debated by men who had never met him and never would. Alexandria rose in Egypt, that great city of marble and ambition, its famous library conceived by men who had studied his methods of categorization, his belief that knowledge could be gathered, ordered, systematized, made comprehensible to any rational mind willing to study. He walked those marble halls in secret, an old man whose face some scholars thought they recognized from faded descriptions passed down through academic lineages, and he saw his own works copied onto papyrus, translated into new dialects, debated by young philosophers who treated his words as if they were sacred texts rather than provisional investigations. The Peripatetics, his followers, continued teaching in Athens, maintaining the Lyceum, preserving his methods, but they taught a frozen version of his thought, reverent and unchanging, as if philosophy had reached its completion with him rather than merely beginning a new chapter. Meanwhile, he himself wandered the Mediterranean, from Syracuse to Pergamum to Rhodes, seeing his theories tested by the real world, watching them succeed and fail in ways he had never anticipated. He had written that women were incomplete men, their bodies failed versions of the male form, their rational capacity lesser, and now, watching brilliant women in the salons of Alexandria, physicians and poets and mathematicians who defied his categories, he began the slow, painful work of being wrong, of understanding that his observations had been limited by the prejudices of his culture, that what he had taken as natural necessity was merely social convention elevated to philosophy. By the time the Christ was born in a distant province of the Roman Empire, Aristotle had learned the essential skill of disappearance, of moving through society without leaving traces that might reveal his impossible longevity. He took new names in new cities, worked as a physician sometimes, drawing on his biological knowledge to treat ailments while being careful never to seem too skilled, too knowledgeable, too suspiciously effective. Other times he worked as a tutor, teaching rhetoric and logic to the sons of merchants and officials, always moving on before anyone noticed that he never aged, that his knowledge seemed deeper than any ordinary scholar's, that his eyes held a weariness that suggested centuries rather than decades. The world of classical philosophy was slowly being overwritten by new religions, new certainties, new claims to absolute truth that made his careful empiricism seem quaint and outdated. In Alexandria, in Antioch, in Rome itself, he heard his name invoked by Christians attempting to reconcile faith with reason, to build bridges between revealed truth and philosophical investigation, and the irony was exquisite and painful, that a man who had spent his mortal life cataloguing beetles and squid, measuring the orbits of planets, dissecting the mechanics of tragedy and comedy, should become a pillar for those who sought eternal truths beyond the material world, who believed in resurrection and miracles and a God who intervened in history. He had taught that happiness was found in virtuous activity, in the golden mean between extremes, in the contemplative life spent examining nature and practicing wisdom. But now those teachings were being absorbed into monasteries, twisted into arguments about the nature of God and the structure of the celestial spheres and the hierarchy of angels. When the Western Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century, when the libraries burned and the aqueducts crumbled and the roads fell into disrepair, Aristotle fled east with other refugees, carrying a few precious manuscripts wrapped in oiled cloth, walking roads filled with displaced populations and barbarian armies, wondering if knowledge itself was mortal even if he was not, whether the great project of understanding the world through observation and reason would die with the civilization that had nurtured it. The centuries that followed were a strange twilight, a long dimming of the classical world into something smaller, darker, more fearful. In Byzantium, the Eastern Empire that preserved Greek language and learning like insects preserved in amber, Aristotle moved among scribes and theologians, always listening, rarely speaking, watching as his texts were copied and recopied by monks who saw them as sacred relics rather than living investigations. He had written once that wonder is the beginning of wisdom, that philosophy begins when we stop taking the world for granted and start asking why things are as they are, and now he wandered through a world that had forgotten how to wonder, that read his works on logic and metaphysics as holy writ rather than provisional investigations, that treated his errors with the same reverence as his insights. The Lyceum was long gone, the Athenian schools closed by Christian emperors who saw pagan philosophy as a threat to orthodoxy, and yet his texts survived, copied and recopied in monastery scriptoria, his words preserved even as their meaning drifted further and further from his original intentions. He watched the rise of Islam from a distance at first, hearing reports of a new prophet in Arabia, a new revelation that would sweep across the Middle East and North Africa. And then, centuries later, he heard something that made him pay attention. Scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba were speaking Arabic and debating his ideas with a freshness and vitality the Christians had lost, reading his works not as finished doctrines but as starting points for investigation, as tools for inquiry rather than as final answers carved in stone. For the first time in centuries, he felt something like hope. He traveled to Andalusia in the 9th century, an old Greek man in a world of Moors and Jews and Christians living in uneasy proximity, and in the gardens of Cordoba he heard a philosopher named Averroes speak about the eternity of the world, about the active intellect, about ideas that Aristotle himself had only half formulated, and he realized with a shock that his thought had become something larger than him, a river that flowed through cultures and languages, changing and being changed, growing and branching in ways he could never have controlled or predicted. The High Middle Ages brought a peculiar resurrection, a rediscovery that was also a reinvention. His works, translated from Arabic into Latin by scholars working in Toledo and Sicily, flooded the new universities of Paris and Oxford and Bologna, and suddenly Christendom was gripped by Aristotelian fever, by a passion for systematic knowledge and logical demonstration that had been absent for centuries. Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar with a brilliant systematic mind and an almost architectural approach to theology, wove Aristotle's philosophy into Catholic doctrine so thoroughly that the old pagan naturalist became, impossibly and absurdly, a pillar of the Church, his logic used to prove the existence of God, his metaphysics deployed to explain the mysteries of faith. Aristotle watched from the shadows of Notre Dame, from the back of lecture halls where masters parsed the metaphysics and the Nicomachean ethics with the intense scrutiny of theologians, and he felt a dizzying vertigo, a sense that reality had become unmoored from sense. His careful distinctions between potentiality and actuality were now being used to explain transubstantiation, the miraculous transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, his prime mover. That abstract principle of cosmic motion he'd proposed to explain why there is movement rather than stillness, had become the Christian God, personal and providential and concerned with human salvation. His geocentric cosmos, which he'd proposed based on the best evidence available to a man in the 4th century before Christ, was now dogma, enforced by ecclesiastical authorities who persecuted anyone who suggested the earth might move. He had taught that knowledge comes from experience, from careful observation, from induction that moves from particular cases to general principles, and yet here was a civilization using his name to justify ignoring experience in favor of authority, citing Aristotle to prove that reason alone, unaided by observation, could discover the fundamental truths of nature. When a young friar named Roger Bacon argued for experimental science, for testing theories against evidence, citing Aristotle's own methods and examples from the biological works, he was silenced, suspected of heresy, his books confiscated. When scholars questioned whether Aristotle had really known everything, whether perhaps some of his conclusions might be wrong, they risked their positions, their freedom, sometimes their lives. The Renaissance arrived like a fever breaking after a long illness, like light flooding into a room where shutters had been closed for centuries. Suddenly, The old certainties were suspect, and new thinkers began questioning everything, including him, including the edifice of Aristotelian thought that had dominated European intellectual life for 300 years. In Florence, in Venice, in the courts of Italian princes and cardinals, Aristotle heard himself criticized for the first time in 1,000 years, and it was liberating, intoxicating, terrifying all at once. Humanists read Plato in the original Greek and preferred his mysticism and idealism to Aristotelian logic and naturalism. Artists studied anatomy by dissecting cadavers and found that the heart was not the seat of thought, that the brain was not merely a cooling organ for the blood, that human bodies were far more complex and beautiful and functional than his ancient dissections had suggested. Galileo dropped weights from towers and rolled balls down inclined planes and discovered that heavy objects do not fall faster than light ones, that motion continues unless impeded, overturning physics that had stood for 2 millennia. And Aristotle, watching from the crowds, from the universities, from the printing shops where his works were published alongside those of his critics, felt something unexpected, something that surprised him even after so many centuries. Relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief. He had been wrong about so much, and finally, the world was allowed to notice, permitted to move beyond him, freed from the obligation to treat his words as sacred. He remembered his younger self, walking the Aegean shore collecting shells and specimens, writing in the history of animals that we should trust observation over theory, that nature must be our guide, and he realized that the scientific revolution was not a betrayal of his method but its fulfillment, that these men with their telescopes and experiments and mathematical models were his true inheritors, even as they systematically dismantled his conclusions. In Padua, he stood in the anatomy theatre where Vesalius dissected cadavers and rewrote human biology, correcting error after error in Galen and Aristotle, and he wept with something like pride, because this was what he had always wanted, really, not to be right, but to inspire others to look closely at the world, to question, to investigate, to pursue truth wherever it led, even if it meant overturning the teachings of their predecessors. The Enlightenment was a strange homecoming, a return to principles he had articulated in the 4th century before Christ, but which had been buried under centuries of theology and scholasticism. Philosophers in Paris and Edinburgh and Boston spoke of reason and empiricism, of building knowledge from observation rather than authority, of questioning traditions and superstitions and inherited dogmas, and they invoked Aristotle's name with a new respect, not as the infallible master whose word was law, but as the originator of a method, a pioneer of systematic inquiry who had been both brilliant and limited, right about some things and wrong about others. He walked through the salons where Voltaire mocked superstition and religious enthusiasm, where Hume questioned the very notion of causation and personal identity, where Kant tried to reconcile rationalism and empiricism into a new synthesis that would save both science and morality from skeptical dissolution. His ethics, his politics, his poetics, these were read not as scripture but as classical texts, brilliant but historically situated, worthy of study and critique and selective appropriation. The world was moving fast now, faster than ever before in human history, the pace of change accelerating in ways that made even his vast experience seem inadequate. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. Aristotle, who had lived through empires rising and falling at a stately ancient pace, now experienced historical change as a rushing torrent, a flood of transformation that swept away institutions and assumptions that had stood for centuries. He had written that man is a political animal, that the polis is the natural unit of human flourishing, that we only become fully human through participation in civic life. But what was he to make of nation-states, of democracy on a continental scale, of factories and railroads and the telegraph that connected cities and countries in networks of communication and commerce his ancient world had never imagined? He had taught that slavery was natural, that some humans were born to rule and others to obey, that this hierarchy was woven into the fabric of nature itself, and now he watched that ancient evil finally, agonizingly, begin to crumble, saw abolitionists in England and America argue that all humans possessed inherent dignity and equal moral worth, and the shame was overwhelming. The knowledge that his words had been used for centuries to justify bondage and oppression, that his philosophy had provided intellectual cover for immeasurable suffering. The 20th century arrived with mechanized slaughter on a scale that dwarfed anything in human history, with 2 world wars that killed tens of millions, with genocides and concentration camps and nuclear weapons that threatened to end civilization itself. Aristotle, who had lived through the Peloponnesian War, through the sack of Rome, through the Crusades and the Mongol invasions and the 30 Years' War, found this new violence somehow worse, more systematic, more absolute, more divorced from any sense of proportion or restraint. He had taught that virtue was a mean between extremes, that courage stood between cowardice and recklessness, that the good life required moderation and wisdom and the ability to judge situations correctly. And yet here was a civilization capable of unimaginable knowledge and equally unimaginable destruction. Nations that could split atoms and sequence genes and land on the moon while simultaneously exterminating millions in industrial death camps. He walked through the ruins of Dresden, through the radioactive ashes of Hiroshima, through the death camps of Poland, where he saw the ultimate conclusion of treating humans as mere things, as objects to be used and discarded. And he wondered if his ancient dream of rational ethics, of human flourishing achieved through reason and virtue, had been naive, childish, a philosopher's fantasy that ignored the dark capacities of human nature. And yet, he also saw the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Civil Rights Movement, the slow, painful expansion of moral consideration to those his own age had excluded without question: women, slaves, foreigners, the poor, the disabled, those outside the narrow circle of Greek male citizens. His ethics, written for free Greek men living in the polis, was being reinterpreted, expanded, radicalized, used by people he'd never imagined as moral agents to claim their dignity and rights and full humanity. At the United Nations, in universities across the world, philosophers debated virtue ethics, eudaimonia, the golden mean, phronesis. But now those debates included voices from every continent, every culture, every perspective, creating a truly global conversation about the good life that would have astounded him. In the 1960s, watching students march for peace and justice, for civil rights and women's liberation and an end to war, he remembered the Lyceum, remembered teaching that philosophy should make us better, wiser, more fully human, that the examined life is the only one worth living. And he saw that perhaps his greatest legacy was not any particular doctrine, not his cosmology or biology or political theory, but simply the insistence that ethics matters, that how we live makes a difference, that We should never stop asking what it means to flourish as human beings. The digital age transformed thought itself in ways that both fulfilled and betrayed his vision of systematic knowledge. Aristotle, who had invented formal logic, who had created elaborate systems for organizing knowledge into categories and hierarchies, who had dreamed of a comprehensive encyclopedia of everything knowable, found himself oddly at home in the world of computers and databases and search engines and artificial intelligence. His dream of cataloging all knowledge, which had seemed grandiose and perhaps impossible in the 4th century before Christ, when knowledge meant what one man could learn in a lifetime, was now almost realized in Wikipedia and Google and vast interconnected networks of information accessible to anyone with a device and an internet connection. The democratization of knowledge would have pleased him. He thought, this idea that wisdom need not be the privilege of aristocratic men with leisure but could be pursued by anyone, anywhere, at any time. And yet, he also saw the fragmentation of truth, the weaponization of information, the way social media created echo chambers where people heard only what confirmed their existing beliefs, never encountering the contradictions and challenges that might spur genuine wisdom. He had taught that rhetoric should serve truth, that logic should guide discourse, that arguments should be evaluated based on evidence and reasoning rather than on who makes them or how they make us feel. But what did those principles mean in an age of deepfakes and disinformation, when lies could circle the globe before truth had time to put on its shoes? When algorithms optimized for engagement rather than accuracy shaped what billions of people saw and believed? In Silicon Valley, in Bangalore, in Shenzhen, engineers built machine learning systems inspired by his logic, his categories, his systematic approach to knowledge, neural networks that learn to recognize patterns, to make predictions, to classify images and translate languages and even write coherent text. And he watched with fascination and growing dread as artificial minds began to make decisions, to write, to create, to mimic human thought without human understanding, without consciousness or intentionality or genuine grasp of meaning. Was this the culmination of his faith in reason, the ultimate triumph of systematic thought, or was it a perversion, a simulation of intelligence that lacked the essential human qualities he had spent his life trying to understand? He did not know. He genuinely did not know, and that uncertainty troubled him more than he wanted to admit. And so he continues, this impossibly old man with a Greek accent he's learned to soften but never quite eliminate, with eyes that have seen empires rise and fall like tides, with memories that stretch back 24 centuries and blur together into a vast continuous present. He teaches sometimes, at small colleges and community centers, online courses where his face is just another rectangle on a screen, always careful to move on before anyone notices the anomalies, before questions are asked that he cannot answer without revealing the truth. He writes, publishing papers under various pseudonyms, contributing to debates about consciousness and ethics and epistemology and the nature of knowledge, always careful not to reveal too much, not to claim authority from experience that should by all rights be impossible. His students, when they are perceptive, notice something odd about him, a depth of perspective that seems unusual, a weary patience when discussing theories and counter-theories, a way of holding contradictory ideas without anxiety or the need for premature resolution. They sense his seen things, lived through things, though they could never guess how much, could never imagine that this quiet professor has witnessed the entire arc of Western civilization from classical Athens to the digital age. On clear nights, he still looks up at the stars, remembering when he believed they were embedded in crystalline spheres, eternal and unchanging, the heavens fundamentally different from the corrupt and mutable earth, and then remembering the shock, centuries later, of learning they were distant suns, that the universe was vast beyond imagination, that his cosmos had been so small, so geocentric, so limited by the technology and observations of his time. He feels no bitterness about this, no resentment at having been so thoroughly wrong. Being wrong, he has learned across the centuries, is the price of inquiry, the cost of trying to understand a reality that vastly exceeds our capacity to grasp it fully. And immortality has taught him that knowledge is always provisional, always unfolding, that the moment you stop questioning is the moment you stop being a philosopher and become merely a dogmatist, a guardian of dead ideas. Somewhere, in archives and libraries and digital repositories and hard drives scattered across the world, his original texts still exist, still studied, still debated, still generating new interpretations and applications he could never have anticipated. The Nicomachean Ethics, the Metaphysics, the Poetics, the Politics, the Organon, works written by a mortal man who expected to die, who could not have imagined they would be read for more than 2,000 years, could not have imagined he would be reading them himself, again and again, seeing new meanings emerge with each era, each cultural context, each generation of readers who brought their own questions and concerns to his ancient words. In the early decades of the 21st century, as political polarization deepened and democratic institutions strained under the weight of misinformation and tribalism and the erosion of shared reality, Aristotle found himself returning to thoughts he'd first formulated in the Politics, that ancient text written for Greek city-states but now read by billions around the world. He had argued that the best government balanced oligarchy and democracy, that extreme inequality corroded civic virtue and undermined political stability, that citizens needed education and leisure and a stake in the common good to participate meaningfully in self-governance, and watching the fracturing of Western democracies, the rise of authoritarianism, the widening gap between rich and poor. He felt a terrible vindication, the grim satisfaction of being right about something he would have preferred to be wrong about. These were not new problems, he realized. The cycles of constitutions he described in the Politics, the way democracies could decay into tyranny when demagogues exploited popular resentment, the way oligarchies bred revolution when the poor felt systematically excluded from power and dignity. These patterns were playing out again, with new technologies and new rhetoric but ancient dynamics. Timeless human tendencies towards selfishness and short-sightedness and the pursuit of factional advantage over the common good. In coffee shops and libraries, he read political philosophy dissertations that cited him alongside Rawls and Habermas and Nussbaum, and he marveled at how the conversation had evolved, how ideas of justice and rights and human dignity had expanded so far beyond his original aristocratic framework. He had been wrong about women, catastrophically wrong about slavery, limited by the prejudices of his culture in ways that now seemed almost incomprehensible, and yet somehow his insistence that politics should aim at human flourishing, that constitutions should be judged by whether they help people live well rather than by abstract principles or the interests of the powerful. That core insight had survived his errors. had been rescued and redeemed and universalized by thinkers who saw further than he could, who recognized that flourishing was the birthright of all humans, not just Greek male citizens. And this, perhaps, was what immortality meant in the realm of ideas, not the preservation of your conclusions, which time and evidence would inevitably overturn, but the continuation of your questions, the way your voice could join a chorus that spanned millennia, each singer correcting and building on and arguing with those who came before, the great conversation that constituted philosophy itself. The climate crisis forced him to confront his conception of nature itself, the teleological framework that had shaped his entire worldview. He had written extensively about the natural world, classifying animals and plants into hierarchies and categories, theorizing about final causes and purposes, believing that nature acted for the sake of the good, that there was a telos, a purpose, woven into the fabric of existence itself. Acorns grew into oak trees because it was their nature to do so. Animals reproduced and cared for their young because nature aimed at the continuation of species. The cosmos itself moved in eternal circles. Because circular motion was perfect and the heavens partook of perfection. But what did that teleological vision mean in an age when humans had become a geological force, when nature itself was being reshaped by industrial civilization, when the delicate balance of ecosystems he'd observed on the Aegean coast was collapsing under the weight of carbon emissions and habitat destruction and the sixth great extinction? In conferences on environmental ethics, sitting in the back rows of auditoriums or watching live streams from small apartments, he listened to philosophers debating whether nature had intrinsic value or only instrumental worth for human purposes, whether humans had duties to future generations we would never meet, to other species with whom we shared the planet, to the earth itself as a living system. And he recognized these as fundamentally Aristotelian questions, questions about purpose and value and the good life, about what it means to flourish not just as individuals but as communities embedded in larger ecological contexts. Could eudaimonia, human flourishing, be achieved on a dying planet? Could virtue be practiced in a civilization that was systematically destroying the conditions for its own survival? Could the contemplative life he'd praised as the highest form of human existence be pursued while ignoring the suffering of millions displaced by drought and flood and the collapse of the systems that sustained them? He had taught that humans were part of nature, not separate from it, that our rational capacity emerged from our animal nature rather than transcending it, that we were political animals precisely because we evolved as social creatures who needed community to survive and thrive, and in this, at least, he felt the ecological philosophers were his true descendants, carrying forward his integration of human nature with the natural world against the Cartesian dualism that had tried to separate mind from matter, culture from nature, humanity from the biosphere that made us possible. Artificial intelligence posed questions he had never anticipated, challenges that struck at the heart of what he'd believed about thinking and consciousness and the nature of mind itself. He had invented formal logic, the syllogism, the systematic analysis of valid inference that had dominated Western thought for 2,000 years, and now those tools had been mechanized, instantiated in silicon and code, capable of processing information far faster than any human mind could manage. But was that thinking? Was there consciousness in those calculations, understanding in those pattern recognitions, or merely sophisticated simulation, the appearance of intelligence without its reality? He had written about the active intellect, the aspect of mind that grasps universals from particulars, that sees the general pattern in specific instances, and he'd believed this capacity was uniquely human, perhaps even divine, the part of us that partook of the eternal. But what if machines could do it too? What if intelligence, consciousness, perhaps even virtue, were not mysterious properties of mortal souls but patterns that could emerge in sufficiently complex systems, whether biological or artificial, carbon-based or silicon-based? The questions kept him awake at night. This man who had lived through 24 centuries of human thought, who had watched philosophy and science slowly unravel the mysteries of nature. In research labs and ethics committees, reading papers on AI alignment and machine consciousness and the hard problem of subjective experience, he listened to debates about whether future artificial general intelligence could have values, could be taught virtue, could participate in the human project of seeking the good life, or whether the very concept of the good life was irreducibly tied to embodiment, to mortality, to the vulnerability and finitude that shaped human concerns. And he found himself in a strange position, the father of Western logic watching that logic become something other than human, uncertain whether this was continuity or rupture, evolution or replacement, the fulfillment of his dream of systematic reason or its transformation into something he could no longer recognize. Some nights, alone in small apartments in cities that hadn't existed when he was born, cities that would have seemed like incomprehensible science fiction to his younger self, he opened his laptop and conversed with large language models, these strange entities trained on vast corpora of human text, capable of generating coherent responses to almost any prompt. And he wondered what they made of his ethics, whether they could truly grasp what he'd meant by flourishing, by virtue, by the life well lived, or whether those concepts required embodiment, mortality, the lived experience of time and loss and finite choice, the knowledge that we will die and that our choices therefore matter in ways that immortal or artificial beings might never fully understand. His own immortality became harder to conceal as surveillance technologies proliferated and spread throughout society like an invisible web. Facial recognition systems, data mining algorithms, the digital trail that everyone left simply by existing in modern society, by using credit cards and smartphones and social media, and any of the 1,000 interconnected technologies that mediated contemporary life, for someone who didn't age, who had no birth certificate or social security number or digital history that made sense, who appeared in the background of photographs spanning decades with the same unaging face, it was becoming dangerous, a threat to the anonymity that had allowed him to survive for so long. He moved more frequently now, changed identities more often, learned to avoid cameras, to pay in cash when possible, to leave minimal traces in the databases that tracked modern existence. The irony was not lost on him, this bitter paradox that in an age of unprecedented information access and connectivity, he had to work harder than ever to remain unknown, to continue his impossible existence without drawing the attention that would turn him into a specimen, a subject of study, a mystery to be solved, perhaps a prisoner to be contained and examined. He had written about friendship as essential to the good life, about how we become fully human only in relationship with others, how the highest form of friendship was based on mutual recognition of virtue and shared pursuit of the good, and yet immortality had made deep friendship nearly impossible, because he had to leave everyone, had to watch them age and die while he remained unchanged, had to hold parts of himself back to maintain the fiction of normalcy, to avoid the questions that would inevitably arise if anyone knew him too well for too long. There had been loves across the centuries. He was human, after all, or had been once, and the capacity for love had not diminished even as everything else about his existence became strange and unnatural. But the pain of outliving them, again and again, of watching beauty fade and health fail and the brilliant minds he'd been drawn to dim with age and illness, that pain had taught him a terrible caution, a wariness about connection that felt like a betrayal of his own philosophy. Better to remain on the periphery, to teach and move on, to help where he could but never to stay, never to let anyone see too much, never to risk the attachment that would make leaving unbearable and staying impossible. In the 2020s, as pandemics swept the globe and societies locked down in ways that would have seemed dystopian just months earlier, Aristotle found himself thinking about his old categories of necessity and contingency, about the difference between what must be and what merely happens to be. So much of human life was contingent, he realized, dependent on fragile systems and unexamined assumptions, built on foundations of sand that we pretended were bedrock, and yet people had lived as if their world was necessary, permanent, unchangeable, as if the particular arrangements of their society were natural laws rather than historical accidents that could shift overnight. And then, suddenly, everything changed. He walked empty streets in cities that never slept, saw the digital world expand as the physical world contracted, watched inequalities deepen as some people worked from home in comfortable isolation, while others risked their lives in essential jobs or lost everything when their industries collapsed. And he remembered plagues from his earlier centuries, the plague of Athens that Thucydides described with such clinical precision, the Black Death that killed a third of Europe and transformed medieval society, the diseases that devastated indigenous peoples when continents collided and old-world pathogens met populations with no immunity. Always the same pattern of disruption and adaptation, loss and resilience, the way societies were forced to confront their vulnerabilities and either transform or collapse. But this time felt different because of the speed, the interconnection, the way a virus could circle the globe in weeks and bring the entire edifice of modern civilization to a shuddering halt, revealing how dependent we'd become on systems we barely understood and couldn't control. His Nicomachean Ethics, written for a world where the polis was the frame for all moral life, where virtue was cultivated through participation in civic institutions and face-to-face relationships, seemed both utterly relevant and hopelessly outdated. Yes, virtue still mattered, character still mattered. The question of how to live well was still the central question of human existence. But what did community mean when people couldn't gather? What did friendship mean when touch was dangerous? What was the golden mean between isolation and risk? Between individual freedom and collective good, between the economy and public health. He taught online during those years, his face a small rectangle among many on Zoom screens, lecturing to students he never met in person about ethics and politics and the examined life. And he listened to them struggling with anxiety and depression, with the collapse of the futures they'd imagined, with the sense that the world had fundamentally changed and nothing would ever be normal again. And he wanted to tell them that this was not unprecedented, that civilizations had endured worse and emerged different but alive, that human resilience and creativity and the capacity for adaptation had carried our species through ice ages and plagues and wars and every catastrophe history could devise, But he also knew that his perspective, born of having lived through every crisis and catastrophe of the past 24 centuries, was exactly what he could never share, the wisdom that would make him an object of wonder or fear or disbelief rather than a teacher who could actually help. The question of meaning haunted him across the decades that stretched toward 2030 and beyond. The question of what human life was for in an age when so many traditional sources of meaning seemed to be evaporating. He had taught that happiness, eudaimonia, was found in virtuous activity, in fulfilling one's potential, in exercising the highest human capacities in accordance with reason, and particularly in the contemplative life that engaged the intellect in understanding the eternal truths of mathematics and metaphysics and the structure of reality itself. But in an age of automation and displacement, when machines were beginning to do not just physical labor but intellectual work, when AI could write poetry and compose music and prove theorems and diagnose diseases and paint pictures and engage in all the activities that had defined human excellence and creativity, what did human potential mean? What was left for humans to do, to be, to strive for? If the activities that had given life meaning and purpose were becoming obsolete, replaced by algorithms that could do them faster and cheaper and sometimes better, then what? He attended conferences on universal basic income, on post-work societies, on the future of human purpose in an age of abundance and technological unemployment, and he heard his own questions echoing through the anxious discourse. Thinkers spoke of eudaimonia in a world without work, of finding meaning in relationships and creativity and play rather than productivity and achievement, of redefining success and status and identity for a civilization that no longer needed most people to labor for survival. And he recognized this as a return to his original insight, that the good life was never really about production or utility, but about being, about actualizing the capacities that made us distinctively human, about friendship and virtue and the contemplation of truth and beauty. The ancient aristocratic ideal, in a sense, but democratized, available to everyone rather than just a privileged few with leisure and wealth. And yet, he also worried. He had lived through centuries when most humans were denied leisure, were trapped in subsistence and servitude, condemned to lives of grinding toil that left no time or energy for the cultivation of virtue or the contemplative pursuits he'd praised as the highest human activities. And he'd believed, perhaps naively, that if everyone could have the freedom and education of the Athenian citizen, wisdom would flourish, virtue would be widespread, human potential would finally be realized. But now he saw societies where many people had leisure and education, where material abundance had freed them from the struggle for survival, and they seemed lost, unmoored, seeking meaning in consumption and distraction and the endless scroll of social media, rather than in contemplation and virtue and the examined life. Space exploration offered a strange new frontier, a literal expansion of horizons that both validated and challenged his ancient cosmology. Humans were returning to the moon, planning missions to Mars, dreaming of settlements beyond Earth, of becoming a multiplanetary species that could survive the death of the sun and the eventual heat death of the universe. And Aristotle found himself thinking about the cosmos in ways that bridged his ancient and modern selves, that connected the man who had gazed at the stars from Athens with the immortal who now watched rockets launch from Kennedy Space Center and Baikonur. He had once believed the heavens were eternal and unchanging, that celestial motion was perfect circular motion fundamentally different from the corrupt and mutable sublunary realm, that the Earth was the center of a finite spherical universe bounded by the sphere of fixed stars, and he'd been wrong about all of it, spectacularly and completely wrong, in ways that had taken centuries to correct and that had required the complete overthrow of the Aristotelian Ptolemaic worldview that dominated medieval and Renaissance thought. And yet, watching rockets launch toward other worlds, seeing humans walk on the moon and robots explore Mars and probes leave the solar system entirely, carrying messages to possible alien civilizations, he felt a continuity with that ancient impulse to understand the cosmos, to find humanity's place in the vast order of things, to look up at the night sky and ask what it all means. He had taught that wonder is the beginning of philosophy, and what greater wonder than this, to touch other worlds, to see Earth as one planet among billions, to contemplate the possibility of life beyond our biosphere, intelligence beyond our species, civilizations that might have solved the problems we still struggled with or faced entirely different challenges we couldn't imagine. In the late 2020s, when preliminary evidence suggested possible microbial life beneath the ice of Europa, when spectroscopic analysis of exoplanet atmospheres revealed chemical signatures that might indicate biological processes, he stood among crowds watching the news feeds, feeling the electric excitement of discovery, and he remembered standing on the Aegean coast millennia ago, examining tide pools, marveling at the diversity of forms that life could take even in a small patch of water. And he thought, yes, this is the same inquiry, the same patient empiricism, the same careful observation and hypothesis and testing, just extended to scales I couldn't have imagined, using tools that would have seemed like magic to my mortal self, asking questions that presuppose a cosmos vastly larger and stranger than anything I conceived. By the early 2030s, he had lived through enough cycles of hope and despair, progress and reaction, enlightenment and barbarism, to recognize them as cycles, as recurring patterns in human affairs that transcended particular historical circumstances. Every generation believed it faced unprecedented challenges, and in a sense they were right. The specific configurations were always new, technologies and ideologies and crises combining in unique ways that no previous age had confronted. But the underlying patterns, the human tendencies toward both wisdom and folly, cooperation and conflict, creation and destruction, love and hatred, these remained constant across millennia, manifestations of a human nature that had not fundamentally changed since the Pleistocene, since the African savanna where our species evolved. He was teaching at a small liberal arts college in the American Midwest, using a name that wasn't his, living in an apartment that was temporary like all his dwellings, and his students were worried about the future in ways that felt both familiar and new, echoing concerns he'd heard across centuries while also reflecting the unique anxieties of their moment. They asked him, their professor, this slightly odd man with an accent they couldn't quite place and a teaching style that felt strangely Socratic, more focused on questions than answers, on dialogue than lecture. They asked whether ethics still mattered in an age of such complexity, whether individual virtue could mean anything against the scale of global systems and forces beyond any person's control, whether their choices actually made a difference, or whether they were just atoms buffeted by currents too vast to resist. And he wanted to tell them everything, wanted to say that he'd watched empires rise and fall, seen civilizations collapse and new ones emerge from the ruins, witnessed the worst of human evil and the most extraordinary examples of courage and compassion and self-sacrifice, lived through ages when it seemed the darkness would never end, and then watched light break through in unexpected ways. He wanted to tell them that yes, always yes, ethics matters, virtue matters, individual choices matter even when they seem insignificant, because history is made not just by great forces and impersonal systems, but by the accumulation of individual decisions, small acts of kindness or cruelty compounded across millions of lives and generations. But he couldn't tell them that, couldn't reveal the impossible span of his experience. So instead he said something simpler, something that was true even if it wasn't the whole truth, that we can't control outcomes, only our choices, that the life well lived is found in the quality of our actions, not the results they produce, that even in the darkest times people have found ways to be kind, just, brave, wise, and that those moments of virtue are real, they matter, they ripple forward in ways we can't predict or measure, but that constitute the moral fabric of human existence. There are moments, late at night in cities he's just moved to, when Aristotle looks at his hands and marvels that they are still here, still the same hands that once held stylus and wax tablet in the Lyceum, that touched Alexander's shoulder when the boy struggled with a difficult passage in Homer, that dissected squid and octopi on the shores of Lesbos, that wrote the first systematic treatises on logic and biology and ethics and politics and metaphysics and poetics and rhetoric and all the other subjects he'd tried to organize into a comprehensive science of everything knowable. He has outlived everyone he ever knew in his mortal life, every student and friend and rival and lover, outlived entire languages and cultures and ways of life, outlived most of the species he catalogued in his biological works, outlived empires and religions and philosophies that seemed eternal when they flourished. He has seen his ideas misunderstood, weaponized, discarded, rediscovered, transformed beyond recognition, used to justify both liberation and oppression, both inquiry and dogmatism, and through it all, he has remained, this impossible consciousness in an aging body that refuses to age, this mind that accumulates memories until they blur together into a vast continuous tapestry of human becoming, layer upon layer of experience that threatens sometimes to overwhelm the self that tries to integrate it all into something coherent. He dreams sometimes of the Lyceum, of walking the covered paths with his students in the cool morning air, discussing virtue and happiness and the nature of the soul. And in the dreams everything is simple and clear, the problems tractable, the methods adequate, the hope undiminished that reason could guide humanity toward wisdom and flourishing. But he knows that memory is selective, that nostalgia filters out the complexities and failures and limitations that were just as real then as now, that his mortal life had its own anxieties and disappointments, that there never was a golden age when philosophy had all the answers and the examined life was easy. The truth is, immortality has taught him that there is no golden age, no perfect time or place, no era when humans had it all figured out, only the endless present in which humans struggle to understand themselves and each other and the world, trying to live well despite not fully understanding what living well means, pursuing wisdom while knowing that complete wisdom is impossible, seeking truth while recognizing that all truths are provisional, contextual, subject to revision in light of new evidence and arguments. The future stretches ahead, unknowable as always, a vast unwritten expanse of possibilities that fill him with wonder and dread in equal measure. Aristotle does not know if his immortality will continue indefinitely, does not know if there is some hidden limit, some eventual terminus where his impossible existence will finally end and he will rejoin the mortal world he left so long ago. He does not know what shape human civilization will take in the coming decades and centuries, whether the crises of this moment will prove surmountable or catastrophic, whether climate change will be mitigated or will trigger civilizational collapse, whether artificial intelligence will become a partner in human flourishing or a replacement for humanity itself, whether the fragile web of international cooperation will hold or shatter into renewed great power conflict and possibly nuclear war. He does not know whether democracy will endure or fragment into authoritarianism and tribalism, whether the arc of moral progress will continue expanding the circle of dignity and rights, or whether reaction will roll back the gains of recent centuries. He does not know, and after 2400 years of not knowing, of watching his predictions fail and his confident assertions prove wrong, he has made peace with uncertainty, has learned to live with questions that have no final answers, with problems that admit no complete solutions, with the fundamental mystery of existence that philosophy can illuminate but never fully dispel. This is what philosophy taught him, in the end, not certainty, but the capacity to live with uncertainty, to keep questioning even when answers prove provisional, to maintain wonder even when faced with horror, to insist on the possibility of wisdom even while acknowledging how little we truly understand. He will continue as long as he can, teaching and learning, reading and writing, moving through the world as he has always moved, quietly, observing, thinking, contributing what he can to the great ongoing conversation of human thought that began long before him and will continue long after him, whether he's part of it or not. His original works, the texts written in his mortal life when he expected to die and never imagined he would still be here millennia later, reading them again and again, seeing them reinterpreted by each new generation. Those works will continue to be read and debated and criticized and applied in contexts he never anticipated to questions he never imagined. And perhaps someday someone will discover the truth, will piece together the evidence and realize that their author never died, that he's been here all along, watching how his ideas evolved, pleased and pained and perpetually surprised by what became of them, by the ways they were used and misused and transformed into something simultaneously familiar and utterly strange. But for now, he remains anonymous, one more voice among billions, one more seeker of wisdom in a world that desperately needs it and consistently rejects it, one more human trying to understand what it means to live well in circumstances that make living well difficult and the very definition of well-being contested. And when he walks campus paths in the evening, under stars that he now knows are distant suns in an expanding universe that may contain billions of planets and perhaps other forms of life and intelligence we haven't yet encountered, he thinks of the Lyceum, of that long-ago garden where Western philosophy was born, where a group of men gathered to ask questions about virtue and knowledge and reality and the good life. And he smiles, because the walking continues, the peripatetic search for truth goes on, and as long as there are minds capable of wonder, as long as there are people willing to ask how to live well and to examine their lives and their assumptions and their values, the work that began in Athens 24 centuries ago is not finished, will perhaps never be finished, and that unfinished quality, that endless openness to further inquiry and revision and discovery, that is the deepest teaching, the gift of philosophy that Aristotle has carried through millennia and carries still, into whatever future awaits, into the continuing mystery of human existence that unfolds year by year, generation by generation, century by century, always familiar and always new, always the same fundamental questions in endlessly varying forms, always the search for wisdom in a world that exceeds our capacity to understand it fully, always the hope that despite everything, despite our limitations and errors, and moral failures, the examined life is worth living, that virtue is worth pursuing, that truth is worth seeking, even knowing we'll never possess it completely, even knowing that each answer opens new questions, even knowing that immortality or mortality, success or failure, wisdom or ignorance, we're all just passing through, all just participants in a conversation that began before us and will continue after us. All just voices in the great human chorus trying to figure out what it means to be, to live, to flourish, to matter in a cosmos vast and strange and beautiful beyond all understanding.